Okay, so now we get to talk about the Gospel according to Mark by Jorge Luis Borges, one of the most complicated writers that you'll ever encounter. He never wrote a novel, he just wrote short stories, and all of them are really symbolically rich and complex and full of a lot of things that might not necessarily seem to be there upon first read. It's actually somewhat common for people to read this story the first time and be like, the story's kind of dull. It's sort of simple. It's just about a guy who, goes and talks to some idiots and then, they seem to crucify him at the end. There is that. But besides that, it seems relatively slight in what's going on. But that's because people aren't necessarily looking closely enough. So one thing about Borges is that he's widely renowned as a genius of depth. He takes deep interpretation up a notch. And whenever anything seems simple in his stories, it's in fact not simple. And I'd even go so far as to say that in some ways this might be the most complicated story that we've read thus far, even though, again, it seems relatively straightforward. So just as a few examples, of how there's complication here. Right at the very beginning, we get it mentions that our main character, Espinoza, that he likes Herbert Spencer and the Lord's Prayer, one of these things given to him by his father, the other given to him by his mother. If you don't really know a lot about these things, it seems like, oh, okay, random fact, who cares? But in terms of painting a picture of Espinoza as a character, it's very sort of complicated because the Lord's Prayer, obviously, is a large tenet of religion and belief and faith, whereas Herbert Spencer, if you guys don't know, he's the guy who coined the phrase survival of the fittest. That wasn't Darwin, that was Spencer. So anybody who cherishes deeply within himself both the idea of survival of the fittest and the idea of the Lord's Prayer is going to be a pretty complicated individual. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. So then we have him go off out into the rural areas, and he encounters these people, the Courtrights. The name comes from Guthrie. They had immigrated over previously. They've lost the ability to read. These are not terribly smart people. They're sort of incredibly rural and backwoodsy. So ultimately, as the story goes, Espinoza ends up reading to them the Bible story, the Gospel of Mark, and he reads this to them multiple times. This is the shortest and oldest telling of the life and crucifixion of Jesus, and these people, the Courtrights, so inspired by the Gospel of Mark, ultimately end up misinterpreting it, thinking that Espinoza is the Savior who they personally need to crucify so that they can achieve the sort of everlasting life that the Gospel talks about. So that's pretty crazy on its surface. Once you start digging a little bit deeper, it gets even more crazy because you start to recognize the correlations and similarities between Espinoza and Jesus himself. Okay, so stick with me. Right from the very beginning, it describes Espinoza. It says, "We may describe him for now as one of the common run of young men from Buenos Aires." And here's the key part: with nothing more noteworthy about him than an almost unlimited kindness and a capacity for public speaking. Unlimited kindness and a capacity for public speaking. Who does that sound like? Okay. And then we get later on, it makes mention, casual mention, that Espinoza, who had grown a beard, so it mentions that he has a beard. Then later on in the story, these people, these somewhat rural people who aren't familiar with the ways of the world, the girl of them has a pet lamb who had gotten hurt, and here Espinoza comes and he puts ointment on the lamb, treats it with some pills, and of course these people look at this as, oh, Espinoza, he's a healer. He healed the lamb. So that's another correlation with Jesus. Okay, so lots of sticky things there. So you can start to understand why the Courtrights would be under the impression that when Espinoza is reading them the gospel, he is in fact giving them advice that their way to everlasting life is via crucifying the one who is giving them this story. Some other things that are interesting connections that most people would never catch in a million years, but Borges very purposefully put into the story, is the issue of Espinosa's name. The name Espinosa is derived etymologically for the name for somebody who lives near a thorn bush. A thorn bush. So obviously that has interesting parallels to Jesus. And at the end of the story, it says, Espinosa understood what awaited him on the other side of the door. When they opened it, he saw a patch of sky. A bird sang out. A goldfinch, he thought. So interestingly, a goldfinch is something that's very close to Jesus. In a sense, it says, legend says that at Calvary, a goldfinch drew a thorn from Christ's brow. So, here's Espinosa. His name means thorn bush. And then, when these people are putting him up to be crucified, he in fact hears a goldfinch. So, that's another thing, where upon the initial reading of the story, you probably wouldn't catch that. I mean, I know I didn't catch it the first time I read it. But upon further investigation, you realize that it's there. And it's not just made up. This is Borges' intention. This is the way he writes his stories. To sort of be able to be cracked open and to be able to be investigated further. Okay? So, what does all of this actually mean? Alright? So, in some ways, this story can be seen as a commentary and a criticism of missionaries. Okay? Because oftentimes you get missionaries who go over to a place where people are illiterate, where they don't have a lot of intelligence, or maybe they're a little bit rural and backwards in their knowledge, and then, you go and you read them religious text, and they sort of do what they want with it. So, this is an example here of somebody going, in a sense, on a mission, even though that wasn't his initial intention, but he reads to them the Bible, they take their own interpretation of it, and they act on it. Okay, so it could be seen as the problem of trying to give religion to people who aren't prepared for it. Okay, so that's one possible thing. Another possible issue is the idea that our missionary, Espinosa, he, in fact, himself doesn't really know what he's talking about. So, towards the end of the story, it says, the Courtright asked him, and the Roman soldiers who hammered in the nails, were they saved too? Yes, said Espinosa, whose theology was rather dim. Okay? His theology is rather dim because, in fact, all of these Roman soldiers who hammered in the nails, they were not saved. So, in fact, Espinosa doesn't really even know what he's talking about. He tells them that the people who hammer in the nails will be saved, when in fact, that's not necessarily the case. So it shows again that oftentimes in missionary situations, the people who are conducting the mission don't really know what they're talking about. So, there's all of this stuff that makes this story an incredibly, incredibly complicated piece that has all of this other stuff going on, because these people are reading this as a how-to. So there's all of that stuff to think about. All of these things make this story a lot more complicated than it might seem at first blush. And these things I've mentioned don't even get to some other things that are in there, like the fact that his cousin was named Daniel. Okay, Daniel, in the Bible, that character is one who's blessed with the ability to interpret. Okay, so that obviously provides some other problems, because Daniel had left the scene. Perhaps if he'd stayed, none of this would have happened, because he would be able to interpret better than Spinoza. Also, then there's the issue of the girl coming to Espinosa to sleep with him the night before his crucifixion. So, this is a really complicated thing to interpret, and just for kicks, I'm not going to interpret that one for you. So think really, really hard. Why would this girl have come to this Christ-like figure the night before his crucifixion to sleep with him? Okay, so try to think that one through, see what you can come up with. Remember, interpretation is just a matter of how good an argument you can make. So do your best. See what you can come up with.